I've never heard music in my life. Not real music, anyway. When I was 14, I watched my mother take a hammer to my phone because a ringtone played for half a second before I could silence it. She brought that hammer down 3 times, her face twisted with fear and rage, while I stood frozen in our kitchen. "Half a second, Madison," she breathed hard, gripping the hammer so tight her knuckles went white. "Half a second of that poison. Do you want to end up brain dead?" My parents believed all music was mind control. Every melody, every rhythm, every note was designed by corporations to turn your brain to mush. We lived in a house where the TV stayed muted. Computers had their speakers ripped out, and even the microwave had tape covering the beep button. Mom said people who listened to music became zombies who couldn't think for themselves. She'd point at strangers in stores and whisper about their empty eyes, their shuffling walks, all signs of music damage. According to them, everyone who listened to music eventually lost the ability to think clearly. That's why the world was messed up, they said. Everyone was walking around with music-rotted brains. Going anywhere meant stuffing industrial earplugs deep into my ears until it hurt. Mom checked each of us before we left the house, yanking on the orange foam to make sure they were seated right. The grocery store killed me because I knew music was playing overhead, but the earplugs blocked it completely. Back then, I still believed them, or at least I tried to. But some part of me was desperately curious about what we were being protected from. I'd catch myself straining to hear something, anything, through the foam. Dad had a whole philosophy about it. He'd give us lectures during silent dinners about how humans were meant to live in natural quiet, how music was invented to make people docile and controllable. He'd point at people on the muted TV and explain how you could tell they listened to music by their empty eyes. My brothers believed every word. When I was 14, I accidentally heard music at school. Someone's headphones came unplugged, just 5 seconds of something with drums and a woman singing before the kids scrambled to stop it. But those 5 seconds were the most beautiful thing I'd ever experienced. My heart raced and my skin tingled, and I finally understood what we'd been denied. I also understood why my parents feared it so much. Not because it was poison, but because it made you feel things they couldn't control. I became obsessed with finding ways to hear more. I'd volunteer to return library books during lunch so I could walk past the band room. I'd dawdle in store bathrooms where the earplugs couldn't block everything. Once I stood outside a church during a wedding and heard organ music so powerful I cried. Mom found me there and dragged me home by my hair. After that, they homeschooled me. My days became silent except for Dad's lectures and the scratch of pencils, but I'd started humming without realizing it. Just tiny melodic patterns under my breath. My brother Ethan caught me and said he'd tell, unless I gave him my desserts for a month. I did it because the humming was the only thing keeping me sane. My youngest brother Liam started having nightmares about music. He'd wake up screaming that songs were chasing him, that drums were beating inside his head. Mom praised him for being so vigilant against the poison, even in his sleep. She didn't see what I saw. A 7-year-old so terrified of something beautiful that his own brain was torturing him with it. When I was 16, our situation got worse. A new family moved in next door with teenage kids who played instruments. Even through our soundproofed walls, you could feel the bass vibrations. Mom went over there daily to beg them to stop destroying our minds. Dad started looking at houses in rural areas with no neighbors for miles. My brothers wore earplugs constantly now, even at the dinner table. One afternoon, while everyone was out, I did something stupid. I found Dad's hidden cash stash and bought a tiny MP3 player from a kid at the library. I hid in the basement storage room, heart pounding, and put in the earbuds. The first song was just a guitar and a man's voice, but it felt like my entire body was waking up from a coma. I listened to 10 songs in a row, each one making me feel more human than I'd felt in years. Ethan found me down there, eyes wide with horror. "You're listening to it," he whispered. "You're letting it eat your brain." He looked at me like I was already dead. I tried to explain that it wasn't poison, that it was beautiful, but he was already backing away. "I have to tell them," he said. "They need to know you're infected." I grabbed his arm and begged him not to, but he twisted away and ran upstairs, screaming for Mom. I heard their footsteps coming and knew it was over. There was no hiding what I'd done. I'd chosen music over my family's sickness, and now I'd pay whatever price they decided. As the basement door flew open and I saw their faces twisted with rage and fear, I put the earbuds back in and turned the volume up. If I was going down, at least I'd go down listening to something beautiful. Mom's hand ripped the earbuds out so hard the cord cut into my neck. Dad grabbed the MP3 player and threw it against the concrete floor, then stomped on it 3 times until plastic shards scattered everywhere. Mom had both hands on my shoulders now, shaking me so my head snapped back and forth. Her face was right in mine, and she was screaming about poison and infection, and how could I do this to myself? Dad kicked the broken pieces toward the wall, and I watched them skitter across the floor, taking with them the only music I'd ever really owned. Ethan stood in the doorway, looking both scared and pleased that he'd caught me. I could still hear the last song playing in my head, the guitar and the woman's voice, and I held on to it as tight as I could while Mom kept shaking me. Dad yanked me up by my arm, and Mom grabbed the other one, and they dragged me toward the stairs. My feet barely touched the steps as they hauled me up. Ethan had to jump out of the way. When we reached the top, they pulled me down the hallway to my bedroom and shoved me inside hard enough that I stumbled and hit my knee on the bed frame. Dad pointed at me, and his hand was shaking. Mom slammed the door, and I heard the lock click from outside, the one they installed last year that only opened from the hallway. I sat on my bed and touched my neck where the cord left a mark. The house was quiet for maybe 30 seconds. Then I heard their voices start up in the hallway right outside my door. They were trying to whisper, but Mom kept getting louder. I caught words through the wood. Deprogramming, intervention, before it's too late. Dad said something about neural damage, and Mom responded with infected. I pressed my hands over my ears, even though I could still hear them. They argued for what felt like an hour, their voices rising and falling. Mom was getting sharp, and Dad staying low and controlled. I lay back on my bed and stared at the ceiling, and felt strangely calm about everything. I'd listened to music, real, actual music, and they couldn't take that away no matter what they did to me now. The melody played in my head on repeat, and I mouthed the words I remembered. The calm feeling stayed even when I heard Mom crying in the hallway. The lock clicked, and Dad came in carrying his big notebook, the one where he kept all his theories. He sat in my desk chair and made me sit up straight on the bed facing him. For the next 4 hours, he lectured me about music and brain damage and corporate mind control. He flipped through pages of diagrams he'd drawn, showing normal brains as organized circles and music-damaged brains as tangled messes of lines. He explained how sound waves at certain frequencies literally rewired neural pathways and destroyed critical thinking abilities. He showed me charts about dopamine manipulation and addiction cycles. He talked about how corporations use music to make people docile and easy to control, how every song was carefully designed to shut down the logical parts of your brain. I nodded when he paused and said I understood when he asked if I was following. Inside my head, I was replaying those 10 songs and knowing everything he was saying was complete nonsense. His diagrams were just circles and scribbles. His theories were paranoid fantasies. And the music I heard was beautiful, not poisonous. But I kept nodding. I wrote down the key points he told me to write down. I watched the light outside my window fade from afternoon to evening while he kept talking. When he finally left, my hand was cramped from writing and my head hurt from holding 2 opposite truths at the same time. Mom brought dinner on a tray an hour later. She set it on my desk without looking at me, like if she made eye contact, she'd see that I was already gone, already lost to the poison. The food was the same as always, but she'd cut everything into small pieces like I was 5 years old. She walked around my room, picking up my books from the shelf and stacking them by the door. My journal went on top of the stack, then my sketch pad, then the 3 novels I was reading. She took the poster off my wall, the one of mountains I'd never seen, and rolled it up tight. When she was done, my room looked empty and sad. Just the bed and desk and bare walls. She told me without looking at me that distractions would only make the deprogramming harder, that I needed to focus on cleansing my mind. Then she picked up the stack and left, locking the door behind her. I ate the dinner slowly, chewing each small piece and thinking about how they really believed this, how they'd built their whole lives around being afraid of something that made me feel more alive than anything else ever had. After I finished eating, I lay on my bed with nothing to do except replay those 10 songs and Dad's nonsense diagrams. I realized the songs were stronger, clearer, more real than anything he tried to teach me. Morning came, and I heard the lock click. Mom and Dad stood in my doorway and announced the new rules. I wasn't allowed downstairs unless one of them was with me. Bathroom breaks had to be supervised, which meant knocking and waiting for Mom to come unlock the door and stand outside while I was in there. They were installing a better lock on my bedroom door, one that took a key instead of just sliding. Dad listed each rule in his calm lecture voice while Mom nodded along, her arms crossed tight over her chest. Ethan was behind them in the hallway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking uncomfortable. Liam pushed past Ethan to see what was happening. His eyes were huge and worried. He asked if I was going to die from the music poison, his voice small and scared. Mom told him no, that they caught it early enough, but he needed to stay away from me until I was better. Liam backed away, and I saw him looking at me like I was already a different person, someone dangerous. The next 3 days blurred together into one long stretch of silence and isolation. Dad came in twice a day for lectures, showing me the same diagrams over and over, explaining the same theories about neural damage and corporate control. Mom brought meals on trays 3 times a day and never spoke, just set the food down and left. They made me write essays about the dangers of music, about how corporations used it for mind control, about why families needed to protect themselves from sonic pollution. I filled pages with exactly what they wanted to hear, writing about corrupted brainwaves and the importance of silence. My hand cramped from holding the pen, and my eyes hurt from staring at blank paper trying to come up with new ways to say the same lies. But while I wrote their propaganda, my brain played those 10 songs on an endless loop. I remembered every note of the guitar, every word the woman sang, every beat of the drums. The music was clearer in my memory than Dad's face during his lectures. At night, I lay awake humming the melodies so quietly, even I could barely hear them. The songs were the only thing keeping me from screaming at the walls. On the 3rd day, I started to feel separate from my body, like I was watching myself from somewhere else. Watching this girl write essays and nod along and pretend to believe things she knew were insane. On the 4th day, I woke up to shouting outside. I got up and looked through my window, careful to stand to the side so no one saw me. Mom was in the neighbor's front yard, her arms waving around as she yelled at a woman about her age. The woman had dark hair pulled back, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater. She looked confused and concerned. Mom was yelling about noise pollution and deliberately poisoning our family, and how they needed to stop their evil music right now. The woman tried to say something, but Mom talked over her, getting louder and more frantic. She was pointing at our house, and then at the neighbor's house. Her face was red. The woman took a step back and said something calm, probably trying to settle Mom down, but it just made Mom angrier. A teenage boy came out onto the neighbor's porch, maybe 16 or 17. The woman turned to him and said something. He went back inside. Mom kept yelling for another minute, then stormed back across the yard to our house. The neighbor woman stood there watching her go, then looked up at the houses like she was trying to figure something out. Her face was worried in a way that made me think she knew something was very wrong here. She went back inside, and I stayed at the window, wondering what she was thinking, whether she believed any of Mom's crazy accusations. That evening, I was lying on my bed when I felt it. A low vibration coming through the wall. It was so faint I almost missed it, but when I pressed my hand flat against the wall, I could feel it clearly. Bass, deep, and rhythmic, coming from the neighbor's house. They must be practicing, the teenage boy and whoever else played instruments over there. I got up and pressed both hands against the wall, then my cheek, trying to feel as much of the vibration as possible. It wasn't the same as hearing music, but it was close. It was something. The tremors pulsed through the wall into my palms, and I could almost imagine the actual sounds, the drums or bass guitar or whatever was making these waves. This was the closest I could get to music now. I stood there soaking it in, these faint tremors that connected me to something real and beautiful happening just on the other side of this wall. The vibrations continued for maybe 20 minutes, sometimes stronger, sometimes barely there. I stayed pressed against the wall the whole time, my eyes closed, trying to pull the music through the plaster and wood through pure wanting. The door lock clicked and I spun around. Mom was standing there staring at me with my hands still on the wall. She crossed the room in 3 steps and slapped my hands away hard enough to sting. Her breathing was fast and her eyes looked wild, darting between me and the wall like the music might leak through and grab her too. She left and came back 5 minutes later with thick foam padding, the kind Dad used to soundproof parts of the house. She tore off strips of tape and started covering the section of wall where I was standing, pressing the foam down hard and smoothing it flat. She did 3 layers, overlapping them so there was no gap. When she was done, she pressed her own hand against it to test and seemed satisfied that the vibrations were blocked. She was breathing hard and her hands were shaking. I realized she wasn't angry, not really. She was scared. She was terrified of losing control over me, of the music getting in despite all their locks and rules and lectures. She looked at me, and I saw fear in her eyes, pure fear, and something else. Maybe the beginning of understanding that fear wasn't the same thing as protection. She left without saying anything and locked the door behind her. That night at dinner, Dad made an announcement. We were all sitting at the table, me with a parent on each side like I might run. Ethan sat across from me looking at his plate. Liam was at the end picking at his food. Dad said he found a property online, a house on 20 acres at least an hour from the nearest town. No neighbors for miles, completely isolated, perfect for protecting us from the infected zone we were living in now. He said we were moving there within 2 weeks, that he'd already put down a deposit and started packing arrangements. Mom nodded along, relieved, like this move would solve everything. Ethan looked up briefly, and I saw something in his face. Maybe doubt, maybe just tiredness. But he didn't say anything. Liam asked if there would be other kids there, and Dad said no. That was the whole point. We'd be safe from outside influences. I sat there with food I couldn't eat and watched my family plan my complete isolation. 2 weeks. 14 days before they took me somewhere I'd never hear music again, never see another person my age, never have any chance of escape. The calm I felt in the basement was completely gone now, replaced by something sharp and desperate. I had 14 days to figure out what I was going to do, because I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't let them take me to that rural prison. I looked at each of their faces. Mom's relieved expression, Dad's satisfied nod, Ethan's uncertainty, Liam's confusion, and I knew that whatever I did, I was going to have to do it alone. That night, I waited until I heard Dad snoring through the wall, then got up to test my bedroom window. I pushed on the frame, and it didn't budge at all. When I ran my fingers along the edges, I could feel where thick paint had sealed it completely shut. I tried the other window, and it was the same thing. Both of them painted closed, probably years ago when they first started worrying about me escaping. But when I examined the door, I found something useful. The lock was just a basic slide bolt on the outside, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. The gap between the door and frame was wide enough that I might be able to slip something thin through to push it open. I tested it carefully with a bookmark and felt the bolt move slightly. I knew this was my way out if I needed it. The next morning, Mom took her usual shower at exactly 7:30. I listened for the water to start running, then slipped downstairs as quietly as possible and headed straight for the kitchen. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Dad's car keys were hanging on their hook by the garage door where they always were. I grabbed them and shoved them deep into a box of cereal in the very back of the pantry behind the canned goods. I was back upstairs and in my room before the shower turned off. An hour later, I heard Dad getting ready to leave, and then his voice got loud and confused. He was looking for his keys and couldn't find them. Within minutes, he was tearing through the house, opening drawers and checking coat pockets, and getting more and more worked up. Mom joined in the search. I heard them going through every room. Then Dad's voice got sharp and accusing. He called for Ethan, and I heard my brother come downstairs. Dad demanded to know if this was some kind of joke. Ethan sounded genuinely confused and denied taking anything, but Dad didn't believe him. They argued back and forth while Mom kept searching. I stayed in my room listening to the chaos I created. Finally, Dad gave up and said they'd have to reschedule the appointment to sign the property papers. I felt this little surge of power knowing I made that happen, knowing I'd bought myself time. 3 days passed, and I spent most of my time at my window watching the house next door. I started noticing patterns in how the family moved around. The teenage boy who looked about my age left through the front door every morning at 7:30 with a backpack. He came home around 3 in the afternoon. In the late afternoon, I could see him through his window sometimes, and I thought he was playing some kind of instrument because I could feel those bass vibrations again. One day, he was in his yard, and he looked up at my window. I ducked back fast, but not before I saw him raise his hand like he might be waving. I didn't know if he actually saw me or not, but my hands were shaking anyway. Mom found the keys on the 3rd day. She was absolutely furious when she discovered them in the cereal box. She confronted Dad about being so careless and misplacing important things. He swore up and down that he didn't put them there. They argued about it for an hour. I could hear the stress in both their voices. But the delay worked exactly like I hoped. I'd been using these 3 days to think through everything, weighing my options and trying to figure out the best choice. If I ran, I had no money, no car, nowhere to go, and they'd probably find me within hours. But if I let them take me to that rural property, I'd be trapped forever with no way to contact anyone or get help. Neither option was good, but at least running gave me a chance. During one of Dad's lectures that afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I actually asked him a question about his theories. His whole face changed, like he was surprised and pleased. I asked what happened to people who'd been exposed to music, whether there was any way to fix the damage. He launched into this long explanation about recovery periods and neural cleansing. He talked about how the brain could heal itself if you removed all musical influence and followed strict protocols. He seemed genuinely happy that I was engaging with his ideas. I nodded along and asked follow-up questions while my real thoughts were racing. I was calculating how much he wanted to believe I could be saved, how much he needed to think his system worked. I realized I could use that. If I acted like I was trying to recover, he might give me slightly more freedom. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I tore a piece of paper from an old notebook I'd hidden under my mattress. I wrote carefully in small letters so the whole message fit on one piece. I need help. They're moving me away. I'm not allowed to leave. I folded it as small as I could and tucked it in my pocket. My heart wouldn't stop pounding because I knew how risky this was. If my parents found it, I didn't know what they'd do, but I was out of options and out of time. On trash day, I did something that shocked everyone. I volunteered to take out the garbage bags. Mom actually stopped what she was doing and stared at me. She looked suspicious, but I kept my face neutral and helpful. Finally, she agreed. Dad watched from the kitchen window as I carried the bags to the curb. I moved slowly and carefully so I didn't seem like I was rushing. The neighbor's recycling bin was right next to their driveway. I walked past it on my way back to the house and slipped the folded note under some newspapers in the bin as fast as I could, praying nobody saw me and praying even harder that someone actually found it. 2 whole days went by with nothing. I started thinking the note got thrown away or buried under other recycling. Maybe the neighbor boy never even looked in that bin. Maybe he found it and decided I was crazy and ignored it. I spent hours at my window watching their house and seeing nothing unusual. I was starting to lose hope. Then on the 3rd day, I was looking out and the teenage boy was standing in his yard, staring directly at my window. He was holding a small whiteboard and he'd written something on it in black marker. I saw your note. My hands started shaking so hard I had to press them against the glass to steady them. I gave him a thumbs up and he nodded, then erased what he wrote and wrote something else. What do you need? I mouthed the word help as clearly as I could, then pointed to my parents' car in the driveway, trying to make him understand that they were planning to take me away soon. He watched me carefully and then nodded again, this time looking serious and determined, like he understood exactly what I was trying to say. Over the next 3 days, the boy showed up in his yard at different times with the whiteboard. He wrote simple questions I could answer with thumbs up or thumbs down. Are you allowed to leave the house? Thumbs down. Are your parents planning something? Thumbs up. Soon? Thumbs up. He erased and wrote more. Do they hurt you? I hesitated but gave a thumbs up. His face went hard. Are they moving away with you? Thumbs up. He wrote one more thing. We're going to help you. I pressed my hand against the glass and he did the same from his yard. For the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone in this. On the 4th day, Mom caught me standing by the window during my assigned reading time. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with this look that made my stomach drop. That afternoon, I heard drilling and hammering. When I came out for dinner, there was a curtain rod installed above my window with thick blackout curtains. Mom pulled them closed and they blocked out all the light. She told me the curtains stayed closed at all times because the outside world was too distracting from my recovery. I knew she meant the boy next door. That night, after everyone went to sleep, I carefully pulled the curtain back just an inch to see if he left any messages. There was nothing on the whiteboard, but I saw a light flick on and off in his window, like he was checking if I could still see out. I flicked my desk lamp twice in response. The light in his window flicked 3 times. It wasn't much, but it was something. I had to be so careful now because Mom checked on me randomly throughout the day, pulling the curtain back to make sure it stayed closed. I started sabotaging the move preparations in small ways. I knocked over a box of dishes while carrying it to the garage and 3 plates smashed. Mom yelled, but I apologized and acted clumsy. I lost the folder with important documents about the new house, and Dad spent 2 hours searching before finding it in the recycling bin. I told him I must have thrown it away by accident while cleaning. When Mom asked me to pack my clothes, I folded everything wrong and mixed summer and winter items until she got frustrated and did it herself. Dad's irritation grew with each mistake, but Mom interpreted everything as me being confused and damaged by the music exposure. She told Dad I was probably having trouble with basic tasks because my brain was still recovering. I had to hide my relief that my act was working. One morning, I woke up to the sound of a drill outside my door. I sat up, and Dad pushed the door open, holding a shiny new deadbolt. He said it was for my own protection, so I didn't wander during the night, but I could see what it really was. He was turning my bedroom into a cell. He installed it while I watched, the deadbolt facing outward so only someone in the hallway could open it. He tested it 3 times, sliding the bolt back and forth, and told me this was temporary until we got to the new house where I'd have more freedom. I didn't believe him. That night, after he locked me in, I lay awake thinking about being transported like a prisoner to some isolated property where nobody would ever find me. I started gathering essentials and hiding them where Mom wouldn't think to look. I took my winter jacket and folded it flat under my mattress. I found some birthday money I'd saved, maybe $30, and taped it inside an old book cover. I took the one photo I had of Liam from before all this started and slipped it between the pages of a textbook. I put everything into a plastic grocery bag and hid it in the back corner of my closet behind a box of old shoes. I didn't have a solid plan yet, but I knew I needed to be ready to grab that bag and run if an opportunity came. The next afternoon, I was watching through the curtain gap when I saw the boy next door in his yard, tossing a tennis ball against the fence like he was bored. He glanced at our house, and I realized he was waiting for me to notice. He threw the ball over the fence into our yard, then made a big show of looking around like he was trying to figure out where it went. I watched him walk along his side of the fence until he was at the back corner where the wood panels didn't quite meet the ground. He bent down like he was looking for the ball, and his hand disappeared under the fence for just a second. Then he stood up, waved at his mom, who was on their porch, and went inside. I waited 10 minutes to make sure no one in my house was paying attention. Mom was in the kitchen, and Dad was in his office. My brothers were doing schoolwork at the dining table. I slipped downstairs as quietly as possible and went out the back door. The tennis ball was sitting in the grass near the fence. I picked it up and carried it to the corner. There was a folded piece of paper wedged under the fence board. I grabbed it fast and shoved it in my pocket, tossed the ball back over, and went inside before anyone noticed I left. In my room with the door closed, I unfolded the paper. My hands shook as I read. The boy's name was Connor. His phone number was at the top. Below it, he'd written that his mom called a family services hotline to ask what they should do about a neighbor kid who seemed to be in trouble. The person on the phone told them to document everything they saw and heard, and to call if there was ever immediate danger. The note said they were keeping a log of all the times my mom yelled at their house and the times they saw me at the window looking scared. He wrote that I should try to get outside if possible so they could witness my parents' behavior directly. The last line said to destroy the note after reading it. I read it 3 more times, then tore it into tiny pieces and flushed them down the toilet. Knowing someone was actually paying attention and trying to help made me feel less alone, but also more scared, because now things might actually change and I didn't know if that was better or worse. The next morning at breakfast, I did something I never did. I asked Mom if I could help with yard work, because the grass was getting long and the garden needed attention. She stopped with her coffee cup halfway to her mouth and stared at me. Dad looked up from his silent newspaper and studied my face like he was trying to figure out what I was really asking. Mom asked why I suddenly cared about the yard. I said I'd been inside so much lately that some fresh air would be nice. It wasn't a lie, exactly. Dad said he'd supervise, and Mom agreed after a long pause. We went outside an hour later, and Dad handed me the weeding tools and pointed at the garden bed that ran along the side of the house near the fence. I knelt down and started pulling weeds while Dad stood 10 feet away with his arms crossed, watching me. I worked slowly and made my way closer to the fence. I could hear Connor's voice in his yard talking to his mom. I knew they were both out there. I was maybe 3 feet from the fence when I reached for a weed near the property line. Dad's hand clamped down on my shoulder hard and he yanked me backward. I stumbled and almost fell. He grabbed my arm and shoved me toward the house. His grip was tight enough to hurt. I looked back and saw Connor and his mom standing on their porch watching everything. Connor's mom had her phone in her hand. The way she was holding it, I realized she was recording. Dad saw it too, and his face went red. He yelled at them that they were invading our privacy and had no right to film us on our own property. Connor's mom didn't look scared at all. She said in this calm voice that she'd already called the police and they were on their way to do a welfare check. Dad's hand dropped from my arm. He told me to get inside now. I walked to the back door and glanced over my shoulder. Connor's mom gave me this tiny nod like she was saying it was going to be okay. Inside, Dad paced in the kitchen and Mom came down asking what was wrong. He told her the neighbors called the cops and they needed to be ready to handle this properly. Mom's face went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds, then settled on this fake calm. She told me to go upstairs and stay in my room until they called for me. I sat on my bed and heard a car pull up outside 20 minutes later. Voices at the front door. Mom's laugh that sounded totally fake. Dad using his reasonable voice. They called me down, and I came downstairs to find 2 police officers in our living room. Mom and Dad were all smiles now, explaining how I was a troubled teen who'd been acting out lately, and they were so sorry if I worried the neighbors. One officer was a woman with dark hair pulled back. She asked if she could talk to me. Dad said of course and gestured for me to sit in the armchair. The officer stayed standing. My parents stayed standing. I was the only one sitting, which made me feel small and trapped. The woman officer asked if I was being harmed. I looked at her face, then at my parents' faces. I saw Dad's jaw tight, and Mom's hands clenched. I said no. I'm fine. Everything is fine. She asked if I felt safe here, and I nodded. The male officer asked about the homeschooling, and Dad jumped in with information about our curriculum and documentation. They seemed satisfied enough after a few more questions. Before they left, the woman officer reminded my parents that homeschooling required proper documentation and regular assessment, and they should make sure everything was filed correctly. Mom thanked them for their concern, and Dad walked them to the door. As soon as the police car pulled away, the fake smiles disappeared. Dad told me to sit back down, and I did. He sat across from me, and his voice was very calm and very quiet when he spoke. He said if I ever tried to manipulate authorities again, they'd have no choice but to take more extreme measures for my own safety. He didn't raise his voice once, but the threat was so clear I felt cold all over. Mom stood behind him with her arms crossed and nodded along. Dad said the move to the rural property was more important than ever now, and we'd be leaving as soon as the paperwork went through. I was sent back to my room. 2 days later, there was a knock at the front door mid-morning when no one was expected. I heard Dad answer, and a woman's voice I didn't recognize. She said she was Sarah Mitchell from Child Protective Services, and she needed to speak with the family. I heard the shock in Dad's voice even though he tried to hide it. Mom came out of the kitchen, and there was this long pause before Dad invited the woman inside. I cracked my bedroom door open and peeked down the stairs. Sarah was a woman maybe in her 40s wearing business clothes and carrying a folder. She was looking around at the foam padding on the walls and the tape over the doorbell button and the earplugs we were all wearing. Her face stayed professional, but I could tell she was taking in every detail. She asked to speak with me privately, and Dad said that wasn't necessary, but Sarah explained it was required as part of the investigation. Mom's face went tight, but she agreed. Dad called up the stairs for me, and I came down. Sarah introduced herself and asked where we could talk alone. I led her to my room. She closed the door behind us, and the click of it shutting felt like the most important sound I'd ever heard. She sat on my desk chair, and I sat on my bed. She asked me to tell her what had been going on. I showed her the new hiding spot where I'd been keeping scraps of paper with dates and events written on them. I told her about the hammer and my phone 2 years ago, about Mom dragging me home by my hair from the church, about the locks on my door and the isolation and the planned move to the middle of nowhere. She listened without interrupting and wrote things down in a notebook. When I finished, she asked if she could take photos, and I nodded. She photographed my room and the lock on the outside of my door and the foam padding Mom put over the wall. She asked me to roll up my sleeves and took pictures of the bruises on my arms that were still fading from where Mom grabbed me. They were yellowish now, but still visible. Sarah told me she was creating something called a safety plan that my parents would have to follow. No physical restraints. Required outdoor time every day. Scheduled follow-up visits from CPS. She said this was not optional, and my parents had to agree, or there would be consequences. We went back downstairs, and Sarah sat my parents down at the kitchen table and explained the safety plan. Dad's face was completely blank, and Mom's mouth was pressed into a thin line, but they both nodded and agreed to everything Sarah said. She'd be back in 1 week to check on compliance. She gave them paperwork to sign. After she left, there was this horrible silence in the house. Then Mom went to the kitchen and started making dinner like nothing happened. Dad went to his office, but I could feel the change in the air. That night, after everyone was asleep, I lay in bed fully clothed and waited. I waited until I heard Dad snoring from their room and Mom's even breathing, and the house went completely quiet. Then I got up and grabbed the butter knife I'd stolen from dinner. The bolt on my door was simple, just a slide lock on the outside. I worked the knife blade into the crack between door and frame. I pushed and wiggled and tried to catch the bolt edge. It took forever. My hands shook and sweat, and the knife kept slipping. I had to stop twice when I heard sounds from other rooms. After 40 minutes of patient, quiet effort, I finally felt the bolt slide. The door opened, and I stood there in the dark hallway breathing hard. I grabbed my bag from where I hid it behind my dresser and crept toward the stairs. Every step sounded too loud. I made it halfway down, and then I saw Dad in the kitchen. He was standing by the sink getting water, and we locked eyes across the dark house. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then he started toward me, and I ran. I ran for the front door, and he was yelling, and I was yelling, and suddenly Mom was coming down the stairs behind me. I got the door open and ran outside screaming, "Help me! Someone help me!" I screamed it over and over. Dad grabbed my arm, and I wrenched away and kept screaming, "Help me, please, someone help me!" Lights came on at Connor's house. I saw his mom in her window with her phone. Dad tried to pull me back inside, but I fought him and screamed louder. Within minutes, I heard sirens. Red and blue lights filled the street. 2 police cars pulled up. The officers got out, and Dad let go of my arm. Mom was on the porch looking wild and scared. One officer asked what was going on, and I told them everything. I told them about the locks and the isolation and the planned move to trap me in the middle of nowhere. I told them I was scared and I needed help, and I couldn't go with them. My parents stood there silent and angry while I talked. The officers looked at each other, then at me, then at my parents. They asked my parents questions, and Dad tried to explain about the safety plan, but his voice sounded wrong. One officer talked into his radio, then told me they were taking me into protective custody for my immediate safety. I was shaking so hard I could barely walk. They helped me to the police car, and I looked back once at the house. Liam's face was in his bedroom window. He was pressed against the glass watching. My heart broke, but I also felt relief flooding through me because I was finally getting out. They took me to a youth emergency shelter on the other side of town. It was a plain brick building with bright lights inside. A woman named Rachel met us at the door and talked to the officers while I stood there shaking. She had kind eyes and a calm voice. She brought me inside to a small office and did intake paperwork, asking questions about my name and age and medical stuff. I answered everything in a flat voice because I was too tired to feel anything anymore. When the paperwork was done, Rachel showed me to a small room with a bed and a dresser and a window. She pointed to the lock on the inside of the door and told me I controlled it. Nobody else. She asked if I needed anything, and I shook my head. After she left, I locked the door and lay down on the bed, still wearing my clothes and shoes. I slept for 12 hours straight. It was the first real rest I'd had in weeks. When I woke up, it was afternoon, and sun was coming through the window. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I remembered, and I lay there feeling strange and empty and safe all at the same time. Someone knocked on my door, and I unlocked it. Rachel told me I had a visitor and brought me to a quiet room with 2 chairs and a table. Sarah was sitting there with her notebook. She stood up when I came in and asked how I was doing. I sat down and told her I was okay. She said we needed to do a full interview and she was going to record everything. I nodded, and she started the recorder. I told her everything again. About the ideology and how my parents believed music destroyed brains. About the hammer and my phone. About Mom dragging me by my hair. About the locks and the homeschooling and the isolation. About the basement incident with the MP3 player. About the safety plan and how they followed the rules but made everything worse. About the planned move and how I knew it was my last chance to get out. Sarah wrote it all down and recorded it all. When I finished, she told me I was safe now. She said my parents couldn't take me back and I'd stay at the shelter while they figured out next steps. I wanted to believe her, but part of me was still waiting for my parents to somehow show up and drag me back. 3 days later, Rachel drove me to the courthouse for an emergency hearing. I sat in a waiting room with plastic chairs while she went over what would happen. A judge reviewed Sarah's report and the police documentation and the photos she took of my room and the locks. The hearing took less than an hour, but it felt like forever, sitting there picking at my cuticles and watching people walk past in suits. When Rachel came out, she told me the judge granted a temporary protective order, which meant my parents could only contact me through supervised visits arranged by CPS. She sat down next to me and explained this was just the beginning of a process, with more hearings to come, but at least I had legal protection now. I nodded and tried to feel relieved, but mostly I just felt tired. 6 months after that night in the basement, I was living with a host family named Linda and Michael. I was doing well enough in school that I might graduate only 1 year behind. My parents were still in therapy with supervised contact only. The reports said they were making slow progress, but it was going to take years. My brothers were getting support while staying at home with strict CPS oversight. Liam's nightmares had mostly stopped. Connor and his family checked in on me sometimes through messages, and it meant a lot that they'd noticed and acted when it mattered most. I still had hard days when the grief hit, or when I worried about my brothers. Therapy was ongoing because trauma doesn't just disappear. But I was safe, and I was learning, and I could listen to music whenever I wanted. And that was a better ending than I ever thought possible back when my only act of rebellion was turning up the volume in a basement storage room, choosing beauty over fear, and finally understanding that silence wasn't protection. It was just another kind of prison.